In 1945, Europe was a graveyard with borders. More than 11 million displaced people wandered among ruins, and 3 out of every 4 European Jews had vanished. Holocaust survivors had nowhere to return. Their homes had been occupied, their families exterminated, and their countries turned into scenes of pogroms even after the war. In the displaced persons camps set up by the Allies in Germany and Austria, thousands lived behind barbed wire under the same army that had liberated them months earlier. In that absurd landscape, a new slogan emerged: "Go to Palestine or die here." Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the Jewish community of the Yishuv, already organized, armed and trained by the British, was preparing for a historic shift. During the war, it had collaborated with the Allied forces, producing weapons, food and uniforms, and formed the Jewish Brigade, whose soldiers fought in Europe under a Hebrew flag. When the conflict ended, Palestine became the destination for thousands of European refugees. In 1948, the United Nations approved the partition of the territory, and Ben-Gurion proclaimed Israel's independence. Just hours later, 5 Arab armies invaded the new country. Against all odds, the Jewish militia of the Haganah, the embryo of the future Israeli army, resisted and secured victory. This documentary recounts how the tragedy of the Holocaust gave rise to the birth of the State of Israel. From the ashes of Europe to the promise of a homeland. To understand how Israel was born, we must return to the war years when the Yishuv, the Jewish community established in Palestine under the British Mandate, began to consolidate as a political and military force. While Europe was ravaged by Nazism, Palestine became a logistical hub for the Allied effort. Food, uniforms and ammunition were produced for the British Army, and thousands of young Hebrews enlisted, hoping this cooperation would pave the way for independence. Fear, however, never subsided. The advance of Rommel's troops toward North Africa raised concerns that the Negev desert would be the next German target. In Jerusalem, crowds gathered before the Western Wall to pray, convinced that the fate of Jews in Palestine could mirror that of European Jews. Defense plans were drawn up, clandestine radio networks were formed, and shelters were prepared in Galilee for a possible invasion. In local newspapers, the word Holocaust began to appear as a dark omen. Despite the fear, daily life continued. The war transformed the country's economy without breaking its isolation. News from Europe arrived fragmented and confusing. In 1942, a Tel Aviv newspaper reported that 1 million Jews had been murdered, but the headline occupied only a corner of the front page. Reports of gas chambers or mass shootings mingled with battle accounts and sports stories. Geographical distance and emotional exhaustion led many to struggle to believe what they read. For recent immigrants, however, the news was unbearable. Nearly half of Palestine's Jews came from Eastern Europe and maintained ties with families trapped in ghettos or deported. Every telegram or letter was a personal wound. In that mix of pain and guilt, a new conviction began to form. The survival of the Jewish people would only be possible in their own land. The Yishuv's institutions, led by the Jewish Agency, tried to respond to the tragedy with symbolic gestures. Fasts, public prayers and work stoppages were organized, but life in Palestine continued its course. The contrast between local normalcy and the horror in Europe caused unease. Intellectuals like Martin Buber called for collective mourning, while others argued that grief should be transformed into political action. From that tension between mourning and action, a new strategy emerged, turning the tragedy into a political argument. That idea was embraced by Zionist leaders. For Ben-Gurion and the Jewish Agency, the primary duty was not to rescue individuals, but to build a state that would ensure collective survival. The immediate goal was to strengthen institutions, consolidate defense, and prepare for independence. This logic also extended to relations with the British. In 1939, the United Kingdom had issued the White Paper, limiting Jewish immigration to 75,000 people over 5 years and restricting land purchases. London sought to appease the Arab population and maintain imperial stability. Even so, the Yishuv's leadership decided to support the Allied cause. "We will fight alongside England, as if there were no White Paper, and against the White Paper, as if there were no war," Ben-Gurion summarized. Nearly 30,000 Hebrew volunteers joined the British Army, convinced that this loyalty would later translate into political recognition. In 1944, the Jewish Brigade was formed, comprising 5,000 men who wore a yellow Star of David on their uniforms, a symbol that transformed from a mark of persecution into one of national pride. Its members would later form the core of the future Israeli army, and their military experience solidified the Yishuv's defensive character. Meanwhile, the issue of immigration remained a point of conflict. Thousands of refugees attempted to reach Palestine by sea. The boats were frail, overloaded, and harassed by the British Navy. Some reached the coast at night. Others were intercepted or sank, like the Struma, which went down with more than 700 passengers. Illegal immigration, the Aliyah Bet, enabled some 50,000 refugees to enter during the war, though priority was given to healthy young people, and the elderly or sick were often turned away. Even the scale of the extermination did not alter this policy. In parallel, the Yishuv sought symbolic ways to participate in the war. In 1944, a group of 30 volunteers was parachuted into occupied Europe. Their mission was to show that the Jews of Palestine had not forgotten their own. Among them was Hannah Senesh, a 23-year-old Hungarian poet who was captured and executed. Before her death, she wrote, "Blessed is the flame that in burning ignites other flames." Her sacrifice became a founding myth of Israeli heroism and reinforced the idea of a people that even in defeat had to act. Negotiations with the Nazis to exchange lives for resources, such as the Europe Plan or the Blood for Trucks operation, failed due to Allied distrust and reservations from Jewish leadership. The British feared a massive influx of refugees. The Americans rejected any dealings with the enemy. From Jerusalem, Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharett stayed within diplomatic bounds. For them, the priority was clear. Without sovereignty, there would be no salvation. When the war ended, only 3 million of the 9 million European Jews remained. Most survived not due to Zionist action, but because of Germany's defeat or the isolated help of anonymous individuals. However, the murder of 6 million became the most powerful moral argument of the century. The survivors, scattered across a ruined continent, became living proof that the Jewish people needed a homeland. From the ashes of Europe, a new exodus began. The first emissaries of the Yishuv, soldiers from the Jewish Brigade and representatives of the Jewish Agency, arrived in Europe shortly after the war's end. In Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen or Dachau, they found beings who barely seemed alive. "They live as if they were still prisoners, without warmth or dignity," wrote one officer. That encounter was a moral shock. The emissaries, trained in the ideal of the new Hebrew, strong and proud, confronted the remnants of exile, exhausted bodies, empty gazes, silence. One confessed that upon entering a barrack, he thought he saw animals, only later realizing they were human beings stripped of everything. Reports sent to Jerusalem reflected a mix of compassion and bewilderment. Some described the refugees as a people without strength or destiny. Others saw in them a miracle of the will to live. In the displaced persons camps, thousands of couples married and had children as an instinctive act of reconstruction. Bringing life was a way to defy death. Ben-Gurion visited Germany and noted in his diary that the camps still smelled of death. But his main concern was not the dead, but the living. He feared the Holocaust had destroyed the human capital needed to build a state. "The catastrophe," he wrote, "has not only been against the Jewish people, but against the Jewish project." His vision was pragmatic. Individual survival only mattered if it contributed to collective survival. He proposed relocating 1 million refugees to Palestine, though he knew the means were insufficient. "The state must rise on the living, not the dead," he repeated. Conditions in the displaced persons camps were desolate. Allied reports, like that of American jurist Earl Harrison, noted that the situation was similar to Nazi camps, except that now there is no extermination. Food, clothing, and medical care were scarce, and thousands died in the months following liberation. In Poland and other eastern regions, pogroms continued, driving surviving Jews to concentrate in Germany, Austria, and Italy. There, a new provisional community emerged, the Shearit Hapleta, the remnants who survived. The Yishuv's emissaries visited these places with a dual purpose, to assist and to select. Humanitarian aid was intertwined with politics. They had to provide relief but also identify those who could contribute to the future state. Young people and children were prioritized, while the elderly and sick were sidelined. Many survivors sensed this distance. They were grateful for the aid but felt evaluated. The emissaries described them as demoralized or incapable of adapting to the pioneer ideal of the kibbutz. Ben-Gurion even said that the best perished first. Still, he knew that without them, there would be no nation. From then on, the relationship between the nascent Israel and the survivors was marked by a mix of need and distrust. Amid the misery, symbolic gestures emerged. In a camp near Frankfurt, a girl approached Ben-Gurion and asked if he was the king of Israel. He replied that he was not, but she insisted, "Yes, you are. Take me with you." In that scene, the hope of a generation was encapsulated, seeing in Palestine the possibility of reclaiming lost dignity. That hope was not individual. It spread across all displaced persons camps. Reports agreed that most survivors wanted to go to Palestine. In the east, pogroms continued. In the west, borders remained closed. Palestine was the only open door, though narrow. Doubts arose within the Jewish agency. Could these refugees adapt to the rigors of agricultural work and collective discipline? Some warned that uncontrolled mass immigration would turn the country into a giant asylum. Despite the reservations, recruitment missions multiplied. In the camps, Hebrew classes, political meetings, and ceremonies with Star of David flags were organized. It was the pedagogy of rebirth, teaching survivors to see themselves as citizens of a nation that did not yet exist. By late 1945, the first boats set sail clandestinely for Palestine. Some were intercepted by the British Navy, others managed to disembark at night, aided by Haganah militants. That operation, the Aliyah Bet, was more than a logistical challenge. It was a political statement. The Jewish people, annihilated in Europe, were on the move again. That flow of wandering lives marked the beginning of the exodus that would give rise to the State of Israel. Truman and Stalin agree, the unexpected consensus on Israel's birth. When the Second World War ended, Europe was home to hundreds of thousands of homeless Jews. Poland and the eastern countries remained unsafe territories. The pogroms of 1946 in Kielce and Krakow proved that return was impossible. Faced with this situation, survivors began an organized escape with the help of emissaries from the Yishuv and former partisans. This movement, known as the Briha, the Escape, became a clandestine network that moved tens of thousands of people to the Allied occupation zones in Germany, Austria, and Italy. There, a wandering population began to gather, made up of those awaiting a destination that did not yet exist. They were known as She'erit Hapleta, a Hebrew expression meaning the remnants that survived, the last witnesses of a Europe that no longer had a place for them. The Briha did not emerge spontaneously. It was designed by veterans of the partisan brigades who had fought in the forests of Poland and Belarus. These men, familiar with clandestine routes and survival techniques, established a human chain crossing the Alps into Italy and the Czech borders into Austria. Between 1945 and 1947, they mobilized approximately 250,000 people, using forged documents, bribing border guards, and relying on the complicity of Allied officers who turned a blind eye. At some crossing points, Soviet authorities facilitated transit. Stalin saw the departure of Jews to the west as a way to pressure the British. In those territories, displaced persons camps emerged, an involuntary extension of captivity. Though conditions were miserable, a collective life was reborn. Schools were opened, newspapers were printed, and flags bearing the Star of David were raised. Hebrew was spoken again, and political committees organized symbolic elections. This impulse was an attempt to transform catastrophe into a new beginning. Emissaries from the Yishuv arrived with a clear purpose: to prepare refugees for emigration to Palestine. They showed films about kibbutzim, taught songs, and described life in the settlements as a promise of dignity. Europe, they repeated, was a tomb. The future lay in the east. Zionist leaders quickly understood the strategic value of these camps. Each refugee was living proof of the need for a Jewish state. Ben-Gurion expressed it precisely. The goal was not to rebuild the diaspora, but to establish sovereignty. The White Paper of 1939, which had set a limit of 75,000 immigrants over 5 years, had formally expired in 1944. However, the British Labour government under Clement Attlee, despite criticising the policy in opposition, kept it intact after coming to power in July 1945. Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin argued that mass immigration would destabilise the Middle East and jeopardise British access to oil and the Suez Canal. London needed Arab loyalty more than Jewish gratitude. With the White Paper still restricting immigration, the Yishuv turned to the Ha'apala, clandestine sea arrivals. From Italian and French ports, overcrowded boats set sail, nearly all intercepted by the British Navy, but each capture amplified global outrage. The Exodus 1947 crystallized this symbolism when, carrying over 4,000 refugees, it was attacked near Haifa and sent back to Germany. The image of Jewish survivors forced back to German soil moved international opinion, presenting the Zionist cause as a legitimate response to persistent injustice for the first time. Between 1945 and 1948, tens of thousands attempted to reach the country. Those detained were sent to Cyprus, where new camps replicated in miniature the complex identity of a reborn people. The destruction of European Jewry forced the leadership to look beyond the continent. In North Africa and Arab countries lived communities previously ignored by the national project. The void left by the Shoah turned this indifference into an urgent demographic need. Selection policies that once favored youth or European education were abandoned. No longer choosing, they accepted any Jew willing to emigrate. Emissaries negotiated with Eastern governments for the departure of entire communities. Sometimes Israel paid for each authorized emigrant. The memory of the failure to rescue Jews during the war weighed as a moral imperative that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, amid Europe's ruins, some survivors chose a different path. Abba Kovner, a poet and former partisan, gathered a group of fighters determined to avenge the extermination. They called themselves Nakam, vengeance. Their plan to poison Nazi prisoners under Allied control caused numerous poisonings in Nuremberg, though no mass deaths. Other avengers acted independently, identifying and executing direct culprits. In Palestine, these actions sparked debate. Some leaders understood the impulse for immediate justice. Others, like Moshe Sharet, insisted that any response must be dignified, not replicating the logic of the executioner. Over time, Nakam's actions faded from official memory as the movement's focus shifted from vengeance to political legitimation. The rejection of Nakam was not only moral but strategic. Between 1946 and 1947, the Zionist leadership launched an unprecedented diplomatic campaign in Washington, London, and European capitals. The Jewish Agency opened representation offices, hired American public relations firms, and mobilized the American Jewish community to pressure Congress. Simultaneously, the Irgun and Lehi intensified attacks on British targets in Palestine. The bombing of the King David Hotel in July 1946 killed 91 people and marked a turning point. The British, maintaining 100,000 soldiers in the territory at an unsustainable cost for a bankrupt post-war economy, began seriously considering withdrawal. The emerging Cold War accelerated this calculation. Both the United States and the Soviet Union sought influence in the Middle East, and Britain was losing its capacity to sustain its empire. The international scene was transforming rapidly. The nascent Cold War altered the diplomatic balance, and both the United States and the Soviet Union sought a presence in the Middle East. The Jewish Agency seized this context, sending delegations to Washington, London, and Paris to insist that no other territory could absorb the refugees. British attempts to resettle them in Europe or Latin America systematically failed. President Truman pressed the British government to admit 100,000 Jews to Palestine, but London rejected the proposal and maintained the naval blockade, eroding its own moral authority with each intercepted ship. Violence in the territory was escalating. Since 1945, the Irgun and Lehi attacked British installations. The bombing of the King David Hotel and attacks on patrols symbolized the exhaustion of the colonial mandate. Meanwhile, the Haganah, the military arm of the agency, sought to maintain internal control, while Ben-Gurion accelerated the creation of a parallel structure capable of transforming into a state. The failure of the 1946 London Conference, where Arab and Jewish delegates reached no agreement, led Britain to hand the issue to the United Nations in 1947. Many interpreted the British decision as an act of diplomatic revenge. They hoped the newly founded UN, inexperienced in territorial conflicts, would fail as they had, proving the impossibility of resolving the Palestinian issue. The UNSCOP Commission visited refugee camps and was shocked by scenes of barbed wire and emaciated children reminiscent of concentration camps. They concluded that maintaining the status quo was impossible. On November 29, 1947, the General Assembly approved the partition plan for 2 states with 33 votes in favour, 13 against, and 10 abstentions. The vote was the result of a fierce diplomatic campaign. The Soviet bloc voted in favour to weaken British presence. The United States pressured Latin American countries and the Philippines to secure the necessary 2/3. France supported in exchange for the Yishuv ceasing aid to Algerian rebels. The plan granted the Jewish state 55% of the territory, despite Jews constituting 1/3 of the population. The assigned lands included the barren Negev desert, but also the more fertile and developed coastal areas. The Arab state would be fragmented into 3 non-contiguous segments. Arab delegates walked out before the vote, declaring they would never accept the partition. Jewish streets erupted in jubilation, Arab ones in fury. Within hours, clashes began. The civil war broke out without a formal declaration. Roads were blocked, settlements besieged, and mixed cities turned into battlegrounds. The Haganah, reorganized into regular brigades, soon adopted an offensive strategy. Under Yigael Yadin's direction, the Plan Dalet outlined the steps: secure communication corridors, occupy strategic areas, and neutralize hostile positions. Operations in Tiberias, Haifa, and Safed consolidated Jewish control of the north, while southern brigades advanced toward the Negev. The war triggered a massive exodus of Palestinian Arabs, opening a new refugee crisis that would shape the region's future. The Arab leadership failed to coordinate an effective response. Local forces lacked heavy weaponry and a unified chain of command. The British, still formally responsible for the territory, avoided direct confrontation with the Haganah and focused on withdrawing. In practice, the mandate had ended before its official date. During those critical months, the Yishuv functioned as a state in formation. Provisional ministries were established, identity documents issued, and a rationing system organized. Taxes funded the war effort and immigrant absorption. In kibbutzim, young people trained while farming. In cities, shelters and field hospitals were set up. The sense of absolute urgency prevailed. If this war was not won, the Zionist project would vanish. Between December 1947 and March 1948, the Haganah was on the defensive. Arab militias controlled main roads and besieged Jerusalem, cutting off food and water supplies to the 100,000 Jews in the city. Convoys attempting to break the siege faced deadly ambushes. In March, the Jewish National Council seriously considered evacuating Jerusalem and concentrating defenses on the coastal plain. Then the Plan Dalet changed the dynamics. Between April and May, operations like Nachshon, which temporarily opened the Jerusalem corridor, and the capture of mixed cities like Haifa, Tiberias, Safed, and Jaffa tilted the military balance. These victories not only secured territory, but also triggered an exodus of between 250,000 and 350,000 Palestinian Arabs before May 14th, transforming the future state's demography. Ben-Gurion feared that a delay would allow powers to impose an international administration. Thus, on May 14, 1948, in Tel Aviv, he announced the creation of the State of Israel. The reading of the declaration coincided with the withdrawal of the last British contingent, and hours later the armies of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq and Transjordan crossed the borders to invade the new country. From the outset, Israel was at a disadvantage. It had 35,000 men against over 50,000 Arab soldiers equipped with artillery and aviation. However, enemy disunity and the Haganah's internal organization proved decisive. Operation Nachshon managed to supply Jerusalem, besieged since March, and demonstrated the new army's effectiveness. As the military structure solidified, the Irgun and Lehi militias were integrated under a single command, transforming the Haganah into the Israel Defense Forces. In this context, arms supply became a crucial and dramatic factor. In January 1948, the Haganah had only 10,000 rifles and no heavy artillery. The UN arms embargo, approved in April, legally blocked purchases. Nonetheless, the Yishuv had begun establishing clandestine contacts in Europe months earlier. Czechoslovakia, then under communist control and with Soviet approval, became the main supplier. Between March and May 1948, 25 Avia S-199 fighter planes, Czech versions of the German Messerschmitt, arrived, along with 34,500 rifles, 5,200 machine guns, and millions of rounds of ammunition. The planes were dismantled, shipped and secretly reassembled. Their appearance in the skies in late May surprised the Arab armies and shifted the air balance. The cost was enormous. Israel paid inflated prices, and many pilots died in faulty machines. But without this smuggling, the war would have been lost. Meanwhile, diplomacy unfolded with the same intensity as the fighting. President Truman's immediate recognition of Israel ensured political support and access to funds. The Soviet Union also recognized the new state, seeking to weaken British influence. For the first time, both superpowers aligned on the same goal. On the battlefield, Arab offensives began to stall progressively. In the north, Israeli forces secured Galilee and captured Acre. In the center, they conquered Lydda and Ramla, consolidating the corridor to Jerusalem. And in the south, Operation Yoav broke the Egyptian siege, enabling an advance into the Negev. The 1949 armistices were negotiated separately, preventing a unified Arab front. The first was with Egypt in February, followed by Lebanon in March, Jordan in April, and finally Syria in July. Ralph Bunche, the UN mediator, led the negotiations on the island of Rhodes. Each armistice established ceasefire lines, not recognized borders, granting Israel approximately 78% of the British Mandate territory, far exceeding the 55% of the partition plan. These green lines held until 1967. No Arab country accepted formal peace or recognition of the Jewish state. By the summer of 1949, the armistices with Egypt, Lebanon, Syria and Jordan set the provisional borders of the new state. However, the human cost was immense. More than 6,000 Israelis died, many of them recent arrivals from Europe. In makeshift cemeteries, Hebraized names coexisted with Polish or Hungarian surnames. Their sacrifice sealed the link between the European tragedy and Israel's birth. Refugees became citizens, and the displaced became founders. Independence, despite everything, generated a temporary consensus that subordinated ideological divisions to the common effort. But the new state inherited deep tensions: the Arab conflict, economic dependence on the diaspora, and the pressure to absorb massive immigration. Between 1948 and 1951, more than 700,000 Jews arrived, doubling the population. Most came from European camps and communities expelled from Arab countries after the war. Israel improvised housing, hospitals and schools amid rationing and scarcity. On the international stage, the young country sought to consolidate its legitimacy by presenting itself as a moral response to Europe's failure. Israeli delegations emphasized that the Holocaust had demonstrated the need for Jewish sovereignty. This narrative became the ethical basis for international recognition, while diplomacy, led by Sharet, pursued practical legitimacy: admission to the community of states, securing economic aid and ensuring stable borders. The war's end left Israel with more territory than envisioned in the partition, but without definitive borders or formal peace. Hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians remained in camps, opening a new international issue. Within the country, the priority was integrating immigrants and consolidating institutions. In 1949, the first elections were held. Weizmann was elected president and Ben-Gurion prime minister. The war had transformed a scattered movement into a functioning state. In less than 3 years, the world went from discovering concentration camps to the birth of an armed nation. The survivors wandering Europe in 1945 became the demographic foundation of the new country. Leaders who prioritized strategy over rescue solidified their vision. The Holocaust ceased to be solely a tragedy and became a cornerstone of political legitimacy. Israel emerged from this sequence: extermination, exodus, and sovereignty. Finally, in late 1948, as the last battles ended in the Negev desert, Ben-Gurion wrote in his diary, "History grants no respite. Each victory heralds a new threat." He knew independence was only the beginning. The country lacked secure borders, depended on foreign aid, and had to integrate hundreds of thousands of refugees. But he also understood that for the first time in 2,000 years, Jews had their own army, government and flag over a territory they could call their own. The century of persecution was ending. The century of construction had just begun. The gold of forgiveness: how Germany bought peace with Israel. With the war concluded and independence still precarious, Israel entered a different phase, turning victory into stability. Initial enthusiasm gave way to the challenges of reconstruction and an inevitable question: how to transform the memory of the catastrophe into a political and economic foundation for the new state. At that point, the Central Committee's decision opened a new stage where the struggle over memory was subordinated to state negotiations. From that moment, it was no longer just a moral conflict between cheers and reproaches, but about articulating a diplomatic position to turn historical demands into concrete resources for a country in deficit. In 1951, Israel faced a severe economic crisis. The population had doubled in 3 years with the arrival of 700,000 immigrants, foreign exchange reserves barely covered 3 months of imports, and food rationing continued. The per capita gross domestic product had fallen 8% since independence. In this context, the issue of reparations ceased to be a private matter for victims and became a decision of national survival. The first challenge was to precisely define what was being claimed and on whose behalf. There were individual demands for pensions, insurance, and personal property. Additionally, there was the collective claim for communal assets, synagogues, schools, archives, and the destroyed cultural heritage. The newly established state, burdened with the responsibilities of absorbing immigrants, sought to consolidate a unified representation that could negotiate on behalf of survivors and Israeli citizens. Thus, an institutional duality emerged. On one hand, the governmental delegation acting officially. On the other, the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany, the Claims Conference, founded in October 1951 in New York by 23 international Jewish organizations, tasked with articulating and presenting the individual and collective claims of Jewish communities worldwide. This division responded both to differing interests and the need to protect the state's political legitimacy amid international pressure. While memoranda were drafted and figures debated, Israeli diplomacy acted with remarkable discretion. The first direct talks with representatives from Bonn were conducted in an atmosphere of calculated secrecy, avoiding public exposure until minimum guarantees were secured. The key meeting took place in December 1951 in Paris, when Felix Shinnar and Maurice Fischer, Israel's secret envoys, met Chancellor Konrad Adenauer at his private residence. Adenauer, a 75-year-old Rhenish Catholic dismissed by the Nazis in 1933, saw reconciliation with the Jews as a way to rehabilitate Germany in the eyes of the West. In that 3-hour conversation, the Chancellor personally promised that his government would accept the principle of material compensation, though he cautioned that the amount would need to be negotiated considering Germany's fragile post-war economy. That meeting marked a turning point. For the first time, the possibility of bilateral agreement ceased to be mere hypothesis and took on a negotiable form. In Jerusalem, the political leadership had to balance contradictory arguments. Against the ethical demand to avoid normalizing relations with Germany, the economic reality weighed heavily. The state faced a crisis of housing, employment, and social services, exacerbated by the massive arrival of immigrants. For many government officials, accepting dialogue with Bonn did not mean renouncing memory, but seeking the means to ensure the country's survival and development. This thesis prevailed in Mapai and the state leadership. Material reparations would not settle the moral debt, but would enable infrastructure rebuilding and provide individual compensations to alleviate urgent hardships. On January 7, 1952, Ben-Gurion presented the proposal to the Knesset plenary. What followed was one of the most violent sessions in Israel's parliamentary history. Menachem Begin, leader of Herut, called for a demonstration of 15,000 people outside the legislative building. In an incendiary speech from the parliament steps, he shouted that Ben-Gurion was betraying the dead, and that there were Germans who killed Jews, and now there were Jews trading with the murderers. The crowd, including Holocaust survivors and Irgun veterans, attempted to storm the building. Police responded with tear gas and batons. Hundreds were injured, and over 400 were detained. Begin was suspended from Parliament for 3 months. Inside the Knesset, the debate lasted 14 hours. Finally, with 61 votes in favour and 50 against, the government obtained authorization to begin formal negotiations. Parallel to this, the negotiations required resolving complex legal questions. What legal basis allowed a state to claim damages for crimes committed by a criminal regime against individuals who were not even its citizens at the time of the events? How could communal property, scattered across countries and jurisdictions, often legally confiscated before the war, be quantified? Israeli jurists developed a novel argument. Israel inherited the rights of the destroyed Jewish communities as the state of the Jewish people. They calculated that absorbing 500,000 survivors had cost $1.5 billion in housing, health and employment. Germany should pay this sum as compensation for absorption costs. This formula avoided impossible debates about the value of human life and transformed the claim into a resettlement expense account. Thus, the Claims Conference assumed a central technical role, compiling documentation, certifying claims, setting eligibility criteria, and presenting dossiers to support claims before German officials and intermediary organizations. On the international stage, the normalization process with a Germany reintegrated into the West did not occur in a vacuum. The Cold War conditioned openings and alliances. The West needed to stabilize the Federal Republic, and Bonn's rehabilitation was seen as a component of Western strategy. The United States discreetly pressured both sides, Israel to negotiate and Germany to pay. Washington feared that an unresolved conflict would damage West Germany's image, just when its integration into NATO and rearmament as a barrier against communism were needed. The U.S. High Commissioner in Bonn, John McCloy, warned Adenauer that rejecting reparations would jeopardize Marshall Plan aid and delay the recovery of German sovereignty. This tension largely explained the haste of some to turn symbolic reparations into a material agreement. The negotiations that began on March 21, 1952 in Wassenaar represented one of the most tense diplomatic episodes of the post-war period. In a small building near The Hague, delegations from Israel, the Jewish Claims Conference, and the Federal Republic of Germany sat face-to-face with recent history weighing on every word. The choice of location was not accidental. The Netherlands offered neutrality but also a reminder, as a nation that had lost 75% of its Jewish population under Nazi occupation. The Israeli team was led by Giora Yoseftal, born in Nuremberg and a former Palmach commander, and Eliezer Shinar, a native of Bavaria, accompanied by Georg Landauer and politically overseen by Nahum Goldmann, a key figure in international Jewish diplomacy and president of the World Jewish Congress. Across from them sat Franz Böhm, a law professor dismissed by the Nazis in 1935 for opposing racial laws, and Otto Küster, a Christian democratic jurist. Not everyone in Bonn shared this willingness. Finance Minister Fritz Schäffer, a former member of the Bavarian People's Party, and several conservative sectors viewed the talks as an unnecessary humiliation. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Ben-Gurion's government followed each step cautiously, aware that failure could affect both the economy and the country's moral image. The initial rounds were marked by distrust. Israel demanded $1.5 billion. The Claims Conference requested an additional $500 million. Germany cited budgetary constraints and proposed waiting for the results of the London Conference on German external debt, scheduled for February. Israeli negotiators feared being trapped in an endless process, subordinated to Germany's commercial creditors. On April 6, after 3 weeks of deadlock, the Jewish delegation left Wassenaar. Yoseftal sent a telegram to Jerusalem. The Germans are playing for time. They have no serious intention of paying. The news sparked outrage in Israel, the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv filled with protests, this time against German bad faith. At that moment, Nahum Goldmann intervened with a parallel pressure campaign. From Paris, Goldmann orchestrated a dual strategy. He publicly threatened to mobilize American Jewish organizations against German rearmament and Bonn's entry into NATO, while privately suggesting to Adenauer that a generous agreement would make Israel a discreet ally in the Middle East, useful for Western intelligence against Soviet advances. He also warned McCloy that the talks' failure would damage Germany's democratic image, just as its external debt cancellation was under discussion. It was a game of intense diplomacy, woven with personal letters, promises and warnings. Meanwhile, within Germany, the issue divided the cabinet. Some ministers feared that accepting Jewish demands would stir domestic resentment in a population that considered itself a victim of the war. Adenauer, however, understood the political value of closing this chapter. Repairing the Jewish people was also a path to regaining international respect. On May 8, 1952, the anniversary of Germany's surrender, Adenauer called an extraordinary cabinet meeting and threatened to resign if negotiations were not reopened with a concrete offer. Minister Schäffer reluctantly yielded. In June, a new starting point was agreed, a package of 3,450,000,000 German marks, equivalent to $820 million, of which $3 billion would go to Israel and $450 million to the Claims Conference. Payments would be made in industrial goods and fuel over 12 years, avoiding currency transfers Germany could not afford. On September 10, 1952, in Luxembourg's City Hall, the document sealing the agreement was signed. Moshe Sharett, Foreign Minister, and Nahum Goldman represented Israel. Adenauer did so for the Federal Republic. There were no speeches. Sharett had prepared one stating that no forgiveness was possible for the blood spilled, but the Chancellor requested omitting any direct moral references. Both knew every word could reopen wounds. The pens glided over the paper in silence, in a brief ceremony that ended months of tension. The treaty's ratification in the Bundestag on March 18, 1953, was dramatic. The Social Democratic Party voted in favour, the Liberals were divided, the Nationalist Right and Communists voted against. Adenauer warned that rejection would cost Germany's reputation. With 239 votes in favour, 35 against, and 86 abstentions, the agreement was approved. In Israel's Knesset, ratification passed by just 7 votes. Israeli society remained deeply divided. The agreement stipulated that payments would be made in kind, industrial goods, fuel, and machinery. Israel established the purchasing mission in Cologne, led by Felix Schinner, with de facto diplomatic status despite the lack of formal relations. The mission functioned as a clandestine embassy. It occupied a 6-story building in central Cologne, employed 150 people, and managed contracts with over 1,200 German companies. Each purchase required approval from Jerusalem's finance ministry, which prioritized capital goods to accelerate industrialization: turbines, cranes, locomotives, chemical, and oil equipment. The agreement's impact on Israel's economy was immediate and profound. Between 1953 and 1965, reparations financed 20% of all public investments. 50 merchant ships were acquired, including 2 reconditioned German liners that became flagships of the Z1M line. 500 diesel locomotives modernized Israel's railways entirely. German funds built the Haifa power plant, the Haifa Bay oil refinery, the Haifa naval shipyard, and Tel Aviv's sewage system. The Negev's phosphate mines received German excavation equipment, tripling production. The national power grid expanded from 300 kilometers of high-voltage lines in 1952 to 2,800 kilometers by 1960. Industrial growth accelerated the end of austerity and reduced dependence on American aid. However, the economic aspect did not eliminate the ethical conflict. Many survivors felt uneasy seeing German goods in Tel Aviv or Haifa stores. In 1954, a scandal erupted when it was discovered that the government had purchased Mercedes-Benz cars for official use. Begin denounced in the Knesset that Israeli ministers were riding in the cars of the executioners. Ben-Gurion responded that the state had to be pragmatic, not sentimental, but ordered that no more German vehicles be purchased for officials. Others, recipients of personal reparations, faced paperwork that reopened trauma. Forms required detailing places of detention, dates, injuries, and property losses, all in German. Compensation arrived slowly, and each claim meant justifying the persecution endured. In the kibbutzim, reparation money sparked ideological crises. In Ein Harod, the country's largest kibbutz, the assembly debated for 3 nights whether to allow members to receive individual payments. Veteran socialists argued that all income should be collectivized. Survivors countered that the money represented their murdered families. A compromise was reached. Members could keep 30%, with the rest going to the collective. In other kibbutzim, decisions were more extreme. Some rejected all contact with German money, others allowed full retention of reparations, creating personal wealth disparities in egalitarian communities for the first time. For Ben-Gurion, signing the treaty was a political victory but also a moral cost. Privately, he acknowledged that the agreement had saved the country from financial crisis, though he cautioned it should not be seen as reconciliation. In his 1953 diaries, he wrote, "We take from Germany what is ours. It is not forgiveness, it is collection. The dead will not rise, but the living will build." He ordered centralized management of purchases to prevent corruption and speculation. Despite initial fears, German compliance was punctual. Goods arrived yearly as scheduled, becoming a key part of the national budget until 1965. Economic cooperation inevitably led to closer political ties. discreet visits between diplomats of both countries multiplied. In 1956, during the Sinai crisis, Adenauer personally guaranteed that German supplies would continue despite international pressure and ordered accelerated fuel deliveries Israel needed for its military campaign. This confirmed that behind the rhetoric, a tacit alliance was forming between two states seeking legitimacy. The agreement transformed Israel's position in the international system. With resources to import technology and expand industry, the country solidified its basic infrastructure in less than a decade. The Bank of Israel estimated that 15% of national growth and nearly 45,000 jobs stemmed directly or indirectly from reparation funds. But its deepest impact was symbolic. For the first time in modern history, a state acknowledged material responsibility for crimes against Jews. This political dimension did not quell internal resistance. On March 27, 1952, before negotiations began, Eliezer Sudit, a Vilna ghetto survivor, sent a mail bomb to Adenauer. It exploded in a Munich police station, killing one officer and injuring two others. Sudit was arrested in Paris and extradited to Germany, where a court sentenced him to 8 years. In Israel, some viewed him as a tragic hero. While some transformed memory into political action, others turned it into silent distrust. Normalization with Germany remained for many an open wound that time would not easily heal. Kastner and Eichmann, the memory of the Holocaust in Israel's hands. While Israel consolidated its independence and negotiated with Europe's recent past, moral dilemmas emerged within its own territory that the young nation was only beginning to confront. Among them was the story of Malkiel Gruenwald, a 72-year-old Hungarian Jew with a black beard and yarmulke who ran a modest 10-room hotel in Jerusalem's Zion Square. Previously a minor diplomat of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and a failed journalist in Vienna amid petty frauds, Gruenwald now, from his hotel renamed Mount Zion, published newsletters attacking leaders of the Hungarian Jewish community, religious politicians, and members of the ruling Mapai party, exposing old rivalries and pre-Holocaust scandals. In August 1952, as the country fiercely debated German reparations, Gruenwald published a particularly incendiary issue. His target was Israel Rudolf Kastner, a lawyer and journalist who had led the Rescue Committee for Hungarian Jews during World War II. The accusations were devastating: collaboration with the Nazis, indirect murder of Hungarian Jews, illicit enrichment, and protecting war criminals after liberation. Kastner, who had negotiated directly with Adolf Eichmann and Nazi officer Kurt Becker, had saved thousands of lives, including 1,685 Jews sent to Switzerland on the so-called VIP train. Yet, those same actions, heroic to some, were an unforgivable betrayal to others. The context was complex and painful. Israel faced the difficult moral position of survivors who encountered figures considered traitors during and after the Holocaust. Some Jews had held authority roles under the Nazis as capos or members of Jewish councils, and many survivors accused them of serious crimes. This led to violence and lynchings in European refugee camps after liberation. To address these cases, Israel passed the Nazis and Nazi collaborators law in 1950, though investigations and convictions were limited and penalties generally light. The trials were uncomfortable and barely covered by the press, reflecting a deep social taboo about the Holocaust in the nation's early years. Gruenwald's publication led Kastner to face a defamation lawsuit initiated by the state. Attorney General Chaim Cohen insisted on the legal action, prioritizing the defense of governmental authority. The trial began on January 1, 1954, before Judge Benjamin Halevi. Initially, newspapers barely covered it, but the case was destined to become something much larger. Defense attorney Shmuel Tamir, a former Etzel fighter and founding member of the Herut Party, saw the case as an extraordinary political opportunity. Ambitious and shrewd, Tamir turned what was meant to be a simple defamation trial into the Kastner trial, transforming it into an examination of the morality and decisions of the ruling party during and after the Holocaust. He questioned Kastner about his relationship with Becker, the selection of passengers for the VIP train that included his own family members, and the omission of critical information that might have enabled armed resistance or the escape of Hungarian Jews. Tamir argued that Kastner had concealed the Nazis' genocidal intent and favored certain groups in exchange for silence, amounting to collaboration and betrayal. The trial expanded far beyond the original defamation charge. It became a national debate on collaboration, resistance, ethics and politics, involving Yishuv leaders and the Israeli judiciary. Tamir sought to delegitimize Mapai, accusing it of protecting Nazi collaborators and prioritizing political control over Jewish lives. Grunwald's role faded, reduced to a catalyst for the debate rather than its main protagonist. The case's complexity lay in judging decisions made under extreme conditions of war and extermination, where the line between heroism and betrayal blurred in the impossibility of the circumstances. While this trial exposed Israel's unhealed wounds regarding the Holocaust, history was about to take a dramatic turn. On May 11, 1960, Adolf Eichmann was kidnapped from his home on Garibaldi Street in Buenos Aires. Born in 1966 in Solingen, Germany, Eichmann had joined the Nazi Party in 1932 and later the SS. During the war, he played a central role in the deportation and extermination of Jews, participating in the Wannsee Conference where the final solution was organized. Though he did not create the policies, he executed them, organizing transports to extermination camps and rising to the rank of Obersturmbannführer. The Mossad operation was meticulously planned. Eichmann was blinded with car headlights, tackled, handcuffed, gagged, and covered with a blanket. No lethal drugs were used. The doctor accompanying the kidnappers warned they could be fatal. He was taken to a hideout 40 minutes away, where he confessed his identity upon recognizing his captors. Later, sedated and dressed in an airline crew uniform, he was flown to Israel on a special flight. The operation was made possible by Fritz Bauer, chief prosecutor of Hesse in West Germany, who feared his government would not act and contacted Israel. Issa Harel, Mossad director, personally oversaw the operation with Ben-Gurion's detailed knowledge. On May 23, 1960, Ben-Gurion announced Eichmann's capture to the Knesset, highlighting his role in the extermination of 6 million Jews. The reaction was one of shock and pride. Streets filled with people reading newspapers, experiencing a collective moment of emotion and relief. The operation sparked fascination with the capabilities of Israel's security service and reinforced national unity. But Ben-Gurion had broader goals than merely punishing a war criminal. The trial was to be a national and historical act of education, presenting a comprehensive record of the Holocaust to Israel and the world. The vision was clear: to educate future generations of Israelis about the magnitude of the tragedy and strengthen national identity. This was especially important for Sephardic immigrants who lacked direct experience of the Holocaust. The trial also aimed to consolidate Mapai's leadership, reaffirming its moral authority over Holocaust memory against Herut's opposition, the same party that had weaponized the Kastner case politically. Controversy arose over whether Eichmann should be tried in Israel or an international tribunal. Ben-Gurion insisted on Israeli sovereignty, arguing that the state was the historical heir of the victims, taking responsibility for Nazi persecution on behalf of the 6 million murdered. He rejected Nahum Goldmann's proposal for an international trial, seeing it as a challenge to sovereignty and an affront to the Jewish people. The Holocaust, he argued, was a unique crime that only Israel, as the Jewish state, could properly judge. The trial also raised complex legal questions. The 1950 law for the punishment of Nazis and Nazi collaborators was retroactive, extraterritorial, and allowed conviction without proving criminal intent, while also admitting second-hand evidence and not being limited by statutes of limitations for crimes against humanity and the Jewish people. These exceptional measures sought to express the Jewish nation's outrage over the horrors of the Second World War and protect future generations against genocides. Gideon Hausner, the new Attorney General, took on the trial's preparation with the vision of turning it into an act of historical remembrance. He coordinated the police investigation through Bureau 06, reviewing Nuremberg documents and gathering information from international archives. The strategy combined irrefutable documents with human testimonies showcasing the suffering, resistance, and heroic acts of the victims. Hausner focused on creating an emotional impact on the public, especially young people without surviving relatives, to directly convey the Holocaust story. Rachel Auerbach, historian and survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, selected witnesses focusing on the horrors of the extermination and resistance. Hausner prioritized authentic testimonies from various social classes and professions, ensuring the trial represented the experience of the entire European Jewish community. Some testimonies were prioritized over public figures to guarantee the most direct and emotional narrative. The preparation also included careful consideration of international diplomacy, especially with West Germany, to avoid generating excessive resentment that could affect political or economic relations. The composition of the court was a delicate matter. Benjamin Halevi, president of the Jerusalem District Court and the same judge who had presided over the Kastner case, appointed himself to the Eichmann case. This raised objections from Supreme Court President Yitzhak Olshan and Justice Minister Pinhas Rosen, who feared Halevi was too emotionally involved due to his background in Holocaust-related cases. A compromise was reached. Halevi presided over the court alongside other judges appointed by the Supreme Court. Eichmann's defense attorney, Robert Servatius from Cologne, also required special legislation to participate, as until then only Israeli citizens could represent clients in Israeli courts. Practical preparations included adapting the Beit Ham Theatre to accommodate over 600 international journalists, with simultaneous translation and access to complete case files. For the first time in Israeli judicial history, television cameras were allowed, turning the trial into an international media event. This attention reflected Ben-Gurion and Hausner's intent to educate and raise awareness, not only among the Israeli public, but also the international community, about the magnitude of the Shoah and the perpetrator's responsibility. Hausner made strategic decisions about the scope of the charges. He could have limited the accusations to specific acts of malice to highlight Eichmann's individual responsibility. Instead, he chose to present broad charges covering the persecution of Jews in all Nazi-occupied territories, ensuring the trial reflected the scale of the final solution and the accused's systematic responsibility. This decision aimed to prevent the perception that the crimes were exaggerated or isolated, ensuring the trial conveyed the full history of the extermination. After Adolf Eichmann's execution in May 1962, Israel realized the trial alone could not heal the collective wound. The legal verdict required a deeper complement, transforming the trauma into national pedagogy, taming the catastrophe, and giving it a permanent place in the state's consciousness. Thus, Mount Herzl in Western Jerusalem became the geography where three inseparable narratives converge: political Zionism, military sacrifice, and the memory of European extermination. On this strategically designed hill, the military cemetery with thousands of graves of soldiers fallen since the War of Independence lies just a few meters above Yad Vashem, inaugurated in 1953. This physical proximity is not accidental but deliberate. It materializes the state's fundamental ideological equation, where sovereignty armed emerges from European annihilation. The visitor ascending the hill unknowingly traverses the complete national narrative, from ashes to the flag, from mourning to resurrection. The memorial's name comes from the prophet Isaiah, "I will give them a monument and a name," which in Hebrew is Yad Vashem, but the quote is strategically incomplete. The original verse concludes, "better than sons and daughters," a phrase secular Zionism could not accept. For the modern state, no memory could glorify death over life. The memory had to be national, not pious, heroic, not resigned. This tension would permeate the memorial's construction for decades. The battle to control memory began long before the state existed. As early as 1942, when the scale of the extermination was just beginning to be understood, various Zionist organizations competed to claim future commemoration. Mordechai Shenhabi, a World War I veteran and kibbutz member, proposed an ambitious memorial park where pain would be transformed into forests, each tree representing a lost life. Simultaneously, the Jewish National Fund launched its own project, selling tree certificates to Jews worldwide for £1 each. This commercialization of grief sparked controversy, but also demonstrated something fundamental: memory could be an industry, infrastructure, and business. After the 1948 independence, David Ben-Gurion tightly centralized commemoration. The government understood the symbolic power of this competition and decided Israel must be the sole legitimate guardian of memory. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs explicitly instructed its embassies to discourage Holocaust monuments abroad. Memory had to have its capital in Jerusalem. There were even radical proposals. granting posthumous Israeli citizenship to the 6 million victims, legally integrating the dead into the nation-state. Though the idea did not succeed, it reveals the intensity with which Israel claimed exclusive authority over the genocide. In August 1953, the Parliament passed the Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Law. Education Minister Ben Zion Adenauer, a historian and survivor, articulated the central thesis. The Shoah was a direct consequence of the diaspora. A people without a state was doomed to extermination. Israel, therefore, was not only a refuge but a historical reparation and guarantee of survival. The parliamentary debate was intense and revealing. Socialists demanded emphasis on the heroism of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, led by youth from their movements. The right denounced, scandalized, that the memorial was built with German reparation money, which they considered blood turned into coins. The religious demanded the space become a sacred sanctuary. The final version struck a tense balance: Holocaust and heroism, two words that would shape all national pedagogy. 2 years earlier, the Parliament had established Holocaust Remembrance Day, strategically set 1 week after Passover, coinciding with the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943. In 1959, it was officially renamed Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Day, reinforcing the equation between victim and fighter. Each year, when the siren sounds at 10 in the morning, the entire country pauses for 2 minutes. Cars stop on highways, drivers step out and stand still, pedestrians freeze wherever they are, flags are lowered to half-mast. It is an absolute, almost religious silence in its intensity, uniting the living with the dead. 1 week later, Israel's Memorial Day for fallen soldiers repeats the same ritual. Between these dates, the state traces its fundamental journey from powerlessness to sovereignty. Visitors to Yad Vashem do not find a grandiose monument, but a collection of sober buildings with discrete lines and Jerusalem stone walls, avoiding any hint of beauty that might seem obscene in the face of horror. Among meticulously planted pines, the library, documentary archives, exhibition halls, and even a cafeteria and gift shop coexist, where books and commemorative items are sold. On every bag, a black six-branched menorah recalls the 6 million. This contrast, the memory imprinted on a shopping bag, encapsulates the Israeli paradox: how to keep mourning alive without turning it into routine. In the main courtyard, groups of schoolchildren and soldiers form orderly rows. They listen in silence while their rifles rest on their backpacks. It is an image that defines an entire pedagogy. Remember to defend, learn the lesson of the past as a guarantee for the future. In this everyday scene, the state's moral equation is synthesized. Holocaust memory is not just an evocation of suffering, but a military lesson, a constant warning of the fragility of Jewish existence without its own power. The journey begins on the Avenue of the Righteous among the nations, where more than 26,000 individually planted trees honor Gentiles who risk their lives to save Jews. Each tree bears a plaque with the Savior's name. It is the first moral respite before descending into the abyss. Then comes the replica of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising monument, with tense, muscular stone figures glorifying physical resistance. Before facing the horror, visitors contemplate these two images: human kindness and armed resistance. They are the only glimmers of light before the darkness. Inside the original building, black and white photographs and brief texts in Hebrew, English and Yiddish predominated. The exhibition chronologically traced the persecution from Hitler's rise to liberation, but evil appeared as an absolute, almost metaphysical force, without deep explanation of the conditions that made the genocide possible. It is a moral, not analytical narrative, evil as a mystery. The images are deliberately harsh, almost unbearable. The intent is not to understand, but to feel. Empathy replaces analysis. As one progresses, a narrow, claustrophobic hallway leads to the section dedicated to Jewish resistance. The design evokes the tunnels of the Warsaw Ghetto through which fighters escaped among ruins. Here, the museum equates victim and fighter in a single narrative. The Shoah becomes an epic. Jews were not merely led to slaughter, but fought with dignity. This message, repeated in schools for decades, helped forge the ideal of the new Hebrew, strong and armed, radically opposed to the perceived weak diasporic Jew. At the heart of the complex, the Hall of Names preserves millions of testimonies where families meticulously record victims' details. The purpose is to restore each deceased person's individual identity, rescuing them from the anonymous mass of extermination. But the project is marked by impossibility. Even after 8 decades of searching, only about half the names have been documented. Some leaders feared this irreparable void might fuel denialists, but the very attempt to name the unnameable became a secular act of faith, a resistance against oblivion. The spiritual center is the Ohel Yizkor, the Tent of Remembrance, an austere dark basalt structure inaugurated in 1961. The room is lit only by an opening in the ceiling, letting light fall dramatically on an eternal flame burning above ashes brought from extermination camps. The names of 22 major camps are etched into the floor like scars: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek. Official ceremonies and visits by foreign heads of government take place there. There is no rabbinical presence or religious liturgy. It is a secular temple where silence serves as prayer. But memory was never singular. Orthodox Judaism created its own parallel language of mourning, rejecting the secularization of suffering. They chose a different date on the religious calendar to recite Kaddish for the tombless dead. Their heroes were not partisans but rabbis who died praying. In 1949, on Mount Zion, they built the Chamber of the Holocaust, a religious sanctuary filled with burned objects, charred Torah scrolls, and ashes. Yad Vashem viewed this space as a deviation, but its existence reminded that memory could not be the state's monopoly. Since the 1950s, Yad Vashem aggressively defended its role as the world's center of remembrance. It blocked projects in Paris and tried to prevent European initiatives. In the 1980s, it had to accept the opening of the major Holocaust Museum in Washington. Israel realized an absolute monopoly was impossible, but never relinquished its claim to supreme moral authority. Over the decades, the narrative of heroism transformed into one of intimate mourning. New spaces inaugurated in the 90s marked this shift: the Valley of the Destroyed Communities, bearing the names of 5,000 annihilated communities, and especially the Children's Memorial, an underground chamber where mirrors infinitely reflect 5 candles, creating the illusion of 1,500,000 lights for the murdered children. A museum director summarized the change clearly. It was no longer necessary to constantly speak of heroism. The word Holocaust encompassed everything. Israeli society, which for decades implicitly judged victims for their apparent passivity, began to identify unconditionally with their suffering. The state stopped speaking solely on behalf of the dead and started listening to them. In the most recent ceremonies, ordinary citizens publicly read the names of the victims, one by one, for hours. Among them, ministers and prime ministers for the first time pronounced the names of their own murdered relatives, breaking decades of personal silence. What was once a patriotic lesson has become an act of national intimacy. In that collective voice between pride and pain, contemporary Israeli consciousness is encapsulated. Remembering is not just a duty but the very form of existence. This story reminds us that from suffering, hope and responsibility can emerge. Understanding how Israel arose from the tragedy of the Holocaust invites us to value human dignity, reject hatred, and always defend peace, memory, and respect among peoples.